This is my second in a series of Beowulf introductory presentations. This one is simply 10 Old English words as an introduction to Beowulf. I was trying to wrap my head around a way to limit my introduction to this sort of complicated, mysterious, amazing, violent, beautiful poem. And I thought an interesting way to do so would be to present to you 10 specific words from the poem that might give us a peculiar insight to the heartbeat of what this poem is. The first word of the poem, it's actually the first word of another poem in Anglo-Saxon, The Dream of the Rood, is what. And our translation by Seamus Heaney unfortunately translates that word to be so, as if we're walking into the middle of a conversation. But the word is better translated as hark, listen, behold, lo. It's an attention-getting word. These poems were recited in a loud room full of warriors, and one would have to command their attention. So the word what, which means listen, basically, not only is the beginning of the poem, but it reminds us that this poem is less a written text and more a performance piece, out loud, a sort of medieval concert for warriors. Second word I want to introduce you to is kuning. And kuning isn't exactly what we imagine to be a king. There really isn't a king, at least until King Alfred in the early Middle Ages. England, for centuries after Rome left in the 5th century, for centuries they were just a group of sort of tribes. It wasn't one unified place. But kuning is sort of the leader of a community. And very early on, we're introduced not to Beowulf, but to Shield Shefson. And it says that that was good kuning, that was a good king. And a good king is defined for us in the very first page of the poem. A good king keeps his people safe. A good king rewards heroism with gifts and forges bonds of loyalty. The king is sort of the center of this of the Anglo-Saxon community. Third is a thane. A thane is, I think we can define a thane as a noble Anglo-Saxon warrior. So not really like a private, but a more upper-ranked warrior. They didn't have those exact designations, but an upper-ranked Anglo-Saxon warrior. Thanes were meant to have a sort of suicidal loyalty. Not unlike people going to battle now. And because of the nature of the weapons, thanes were often called shoulder companions, because in order to maintain your own personal safety, you would have to remain shoulder to shoulder with your fellow warriors. And the worst fate that could befall you is to be alone, and we'll get to that later. So a thane is a noble warrior. The drink of choice in Anglo-Saxon England was mead, which is pretty much fermented honey. In graduate school, I was able to take a Beowulf class, and our professor made us a few different kinds of mead. One he deemed authentic, which, let me just say, one wouldn't be allowed to operate heavy machinery afterwards if one consumed that now. It had the sort of consistency of maple syrup. And then you can get a lot of mead now in stores. It's sort of a watered down honey beer-like substance. But less about what it is in terms of alcohol, but its significance was interesting. Where we are in this picture here is a mead hall. And there is a very famous mead hall in Beowulf, very early on, that's built. And the mead hall is meant to provide security and community for a tribe, for a group of for warriors. Here we have the kuning, and here we have the queen. The kuning is sitting on his seat of gifts, his gift stole, his stool of gifts. from which he dispenses gifts to his warriors for being loyal in war, and thereby provides sort of mutually beneficial relationship. The warriors fight heroically and protect the group, and the king dispenses gifts. The queen often passes the mead cup to the warriors as a symbolic way to remind them of their duty to be heroic. So mead, yes, is an alcoholic substance, but the mead hall and the security and relationships and community it provides was really the heartbeat of the civilization. Now, one of the strangest ideas that we come across is ware guild, literally meaning man ware, which you might, if you know Latin, you might recognize VIR, ware guild, man price. And as a way to maintain sort of the relative safety of a community, if one were to go and uh, maybe dismember, knock out the teeth of someone in your community, you'd have to pay ware guild. And Anglo-Saxon law codes were very specific about what different body parts cost: thumbs, legs, and then depending on the rank you were, if you were a slave, you'd have to pay less. If you were upper class, you'd have to pay more. And the purpose was to discourage needless violence. And this was taken very seriously. I want to point this out. So ware guild, you could say, is man price, and it's sort of a tacit agreement of Anglo-Saxon community to avoid needless violence. What does it say? I would argue the more interesting thing than the definition is, what does it say that they have a word for this? That they have a word about how much money you'd have to pay a community for dismemberment, right? There's a word in ancient Greek, dupein, Doupein, and it's in ancient Greek. It was actually the sound a decapitated head would make when it hit the ground. When I teach the Odyssey, I tell my students, yes, that's a term you can memorize, but more interestingly is, what does it say that they have a word for that? And it just tells you what their day-to-day life might have involved. Sixth word, kenning. A kenning is a compound descriptive word, a compound descriptive word. It's from the Old Norse word meaning to know or to perceive. So the understanding is that the kenning actually gives us a very interesting window into the culture. So early on, we get whale road, Hron Rod, which just means ocean. But isn't that more interesting? The road of the whales, right? One of my favorites is, rather than say blood, they say, the poet says, Hildeswat, which is battle sweat, and isn't blood, battle sweat, the sweat in battle. And Grendel, the monster, is described as the Shea du Genga, the shadow stalker. So these are just infinitely more interesting descriptive terms that we see in the poem. 7, Shope, not scope, Shope. The Shope was the poet of the mead hall, also the historian of the mead hall. And the Shope would sing old tales of warriors from the mead hall to inspire the present warriors to fight heroically in battle. The Shope would improvise tales that were more recent, inspired by more recent events. The Shope wasn't simply a poet, but was the historian and the inspirer of heroism for the community. Because the way people got to live forever in pagan Anglo-Saxon England wasn't through some idea of heaven, but rather it was a narrative immortality. Simply put, you fight heroically in battle, and this poet, this Shope, sings of your heroism in the mead hall forever. And that isn't really crazy. I think of relatives of mine. I think of my grandmother that I tell stories about on the holidays. And in a way, when I tell stories of my long gone grandparents, they in a way are present and are alive at that table. So the Shope was that provider. The Shope would deliver poems like Beowulf. Word number 8, one of the more interesting Anglo-Saxon words that I've learned a bit about recently. Rekka was the worst thing you could be. We get the word wretched from it, which is obviously negative. It means one who's doomed. It means someone who's alone, which in Anglo-Saxon England means you're doomed. Interestingly, in Tolkien's version of Beowulf, in the footnotes, he also defines Rekka as another synonym for hero. So here we have a word that can mean the worst possible situation you could be in, someone who's utterly alone and isolated. But also, Tolkien reminds us that because that's the most challenging situation to be in, it can also lead to your heroic behavior. Complicated word. It means someone who's alone, and it could also potentially mean hero. One of the most important words in the poem is weird. You've seen this word before, actually. There's a good chance if you remember Macbeth, and you remember the Weird sisters, right? The word weird in Anglo-Saxon is often translated as fate. Tolkien doesn't like that translation. He just says that weird is simply what happens, not that there's some grand force that oversees what happens, which fate seems to suggest, but it's simply what happens. Fate is a fine definition for our purposes. The ancient Greeks had Moria. Latin authors had Fortuna. Star Wars had the Force, you could argue. The reason why in Macbeth they're called the Weird Sisters isn't because, they have beards and bad breath, but rather they can tell you your fate. So that's why they're the Weird Sisters. And one of the central questions of Beowulf is, are the events determined in advance, or is Beowulf making his own heroic choices, or is it some other strange possibility? And lastly, and here we have the Shire, Tolkien Shire. Don't you want to move there? I think it's in New Zealand, but that's another conversation. The last word I want to share with you is Midan Yerd. And what we get is Midan is middle, and Yerd is our word yard, right? So you can see where Middle Earth comes from. It occurs 6 times in Beowulf, and it's where Tolkien gets his idea of Middle Earth. Norse poets had this notion of a heaven and of a hell, not exactly the Christian notion, but they had their own version. And Middle Earth, Midanyerd, is simply, in Anglo-Saxon poetry, again, borrowing from the Norse, is simply the world, the existence in which we occupy now. But I want to suggest that the interesting thing is the fact that the word Midan is there suggests that these people are walking around knowing that there's a universe that's bigger than them, that there's a fate, that there's other destinations ahead. And it's a world that's constantly surprising at how big it is. So I would just suggest going forward to enjoy the poem and try to listen to the poem uh, like a warrior. Maybe you can't have a mead hall, and maybe your parents won't allow you mead, but listen to the poem, attend to it carefully, um, because it survived, and we owe it that.